Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to UJ Let's Talk. I am your host, and my name is Sindi. All right, and this house, as the University of Johannesburg Internal Bursary Department, would allocate funding based only on merits and not for marginalized identity groups. To my right-hand side, we have the team proposition who is proposing, and to my left, we have team opposition who is opposing the topic today.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I am Bo. I am the first speaker from the proposition team, and I will start my speech. Marginalized people ought to be recognized for their skills, for their abilities, and for their talent. Their prowess should be at the forefront of their success. A success that shouldn't be diminished by the color of their skin, by their gender identity, by their sexuality, or any other identity that they might hold. What are we going to prove today as a proposition? Two things. One, that awarding bursaries on the basis of a marginalized identity is counterintuitive to the prospects of success of those groups of people. But secondly, we don't think it's something that's feasible and sustainable in the long run. What do we want you to take notice of before getting into the specific substantive matter of this speech? Firstly, we understand why affirmative action exists and why it's necessary, specifically in that it was created to allow marginalized people to enter into spaces that they otherwise would not have been able to get into. So for example, the reason why we have affirmative action policies in schools is to allow more Black people into those institutions because they were denied on the basis of their skin color. What is important then, in terms of affirmative action, is to note the context in which it exists in. That is, it exists specifically when there are little marginalized identities in those spaces. Or even if there are marginalized identities in those spaces, there's not enough of them to achieve the kind of equality, to achieve the kind of equity we want. So the context in which affirmative action policies ought to exist in is specifically when there's not enough representation in the status quo. Why is this particularly important to note in the context of UJ? UJ was formerly known as the Rand Afrikaans University, a predominantly white school, a predominantly male institution that catered to the rich, that excluded the vast majority of people. As of 2005, the school has become more accessible and more inclusive of diverse student body. What does this tell you specifically? It tells you that the objective of UJ as an institution is one that is meant to enable access to higher education for the vast majority of students. This is why we see a student body at UJ that is largely Black, that is largely from the working class, because the school is trying to achieve access. So, why is this particularly important then in terms of affirmative action? One, it tells you that in the current status quo, where we have a lot of representation, affirmative action is no longer a necessity. My second speaker will deal with the feasibility around having an affirmative action in this context. But secondly, and most importantly, it tells you that the purpose of UJ as an institution, again, like we said, is to recognize marginalized identity groups. Now, let's bring this back to 2023. In 2023, we all know of intersectional politics, right? The idea, or intersectionality, the idea that an individual can hold multiple identity groups from various oppressive backgrounds. So for example, I would hold the identity groups of being a woman, of being Black, both groups that are recognized as previously disadvantaged, right? So, in that context then, the problem with awarding bursaries specifically on the basis of a marginalized identity group is it then leads to a lot of uncertainty within oppressed people. Because let's give you a real life example, right? You have a Black woman who is oppressed on the grounds of her Blackness and her race, and you have a white disabled poor person who's oppressed because of their level of poverty that they exist in, and also on the fact that they're disabled. Who do you pick between those two groups? It creates a lot of uncertainty because it seeks to invalidate the oppressive experiences that one individual faces over another. So we don't know what value we hold on which oppressive identity. But for argument's sake, even if UJ was to say, listen, we'll only decide on the basis of race and gender, even in that instance, we still think you're leaving out a lot of people out of the chat. What's important to note then is that in the status quo, we already have a merit system that exists. Things like Abo U Genius, things like Orange Carpet exist specifically to highlight the merit of students. So we think with this policy, we're not introducing anything new. We're still allowing for marginalized people to shine in those spaces, but we want their talents to be at the forefront of that conversation and not their race and not their gender. I'm very proud to propose.
Over to the opposing team. Thank you, Theodore.
Thank you very much. My name is Theodore, and I'm from the opposing team, UJTV. So the one biggest presumption from team proposition that we get is that one, these said marginalized groups are largely able to achieve the sort of merits and the sort of established success that they can merely on the basis that they're just good enough, and whatever backgrounds that they come from or just minor setbacks that they just so happen to overcome within the situation, right? Now, the intrinsic problem that we find with this sort of line of thinking is that one, it doesn't really take in consideration of what it actually means to be a student within UJ. Moreover, it doesn't really take into consideration what it means to be a student within UJ and living in DFC and living in the sort of situations where you are part of a marginalized group and where you are like your success is a lot more based on how well you perform, based on where you're living, how much you're paying for those certain resources, and how well and how well you're fed within these sort of contexts, right? That's the one problem that we get from team proposition. What exactly are we proposing as team opposition, right? We tell you that we ought to not only just look for merit when we're considering the people that we ought to allocate funding to, but we also ought to think about the sort of backgrounds that these people come from, right? Because these aren't just marginalized groups because these aren't just marginalized groups as they've conceded that, yes, they do come from disadvantaged backgrounds, right? These backgrounds still play a large part, an integral part, may I add, into being a student and how well you perform within studying as a student and achieving the sort of success that you need to achieve, right? So, say for instance, if you're a white, wealthy student, you are more likely to succeed because you live in much safer areas, because you can afford the accommodation that you want to go to, and you have enough food because you don't have to worry about the amount of food that you're gonna run out of, and you can properly think about your next projects, your next assignments without worrying about what you're gonna eat the next day. And you also don't have to worry about your safety because you're in an accommodation that's a lot closer, in close proximity to a school. Their problem is that they think just because you're black and just because they're white, we shouldn't consider these sorts of things. We shouldn't consider these sorts of setbacks for students who particularly are suffering from these sort of disadvantages that prevent them from getting the sort of merits that they need to get in order to become successful within whatever field that they want to study towards, right? And that's particularly the problem that we get from proposition. If we are to choose between a black disadvantaged, a black woman, and a white disadvantaged poverty-stricken one, we'll take both of them. We can do it. We know UJ to do this, right? And we can't compare UJ to any other institution. We can't compare UJ to any other institution because UJ is largely the top university within Africa because of its inclusivity, right? And the sort of barriers like poverty, like being disabled, are the sorts of resources that we provide for these students in order to accomplish what they need to. And so, as the UJ Internal Bursary Department, we ought to think about these sorts of criteria when allocating merits, when allocating bursary fundings to said students, right? And largely, my second speaker will go on further and show you why exactly we'd have a much better world rather than the world that they're proposing, right? When we enact criteria that consider merit and your marginalized identity groups, because these aren't just groups merely because that they're incapable of saying. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that setbacks are a thing. They are part of life, and therefore we need to alleviate whatever problems that these certain individuals might come across and preventing them from being the best students they can possibly be. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, proposing team.
Right. Hi, I am Alex from the UJTV Union and I am the Deputy Chairperson. So let's just respond quickly to what Kamu has brought to the table, right? So first of all, my speaker has already noted what the importance of merit actually looks like within a marginalized community, right? So one thing to respond to, and that's a very, very big contention that we get from opposition, is this idea that, hey, when you're marginalized as a student, you are basically alone in Dorfontein. We tell you that's not the case, because we tell you at the point at which UJ has a majority of those students who actually fall in that marginalized group, we think that then you're not alone. But what does this mean then in terms of what Mambo has actually brought to the table? It means that you're also looking at basically having a holistic sort of value input that you approach bursaries and you approach being able to give those bursaries thereof. What does this then mean, right? In terms of the context that Mambo has once again already gave you. We talked about the idea of intersectionality, right? And how within those same marginalized groups, you still get that type of those type of struggles that are prioritized over others. But we think that this is not an ethical way to approach a decision making like a bursary. Right? This is largely what you get as a point of contention from opposition, that they want us to just basically look at the circumstances as well on top of merit. But we think that when it has to do with more than just 10,000 kids who actually qualify for this or who actually fall under this category, then it becomes a problem. And this is where I'm actually going to go on in extending the case that we actually have in terms of the sustainability issues that you're likely to face. But then also secondly, even if we're actually only to take this idea of marginalization within identity groups and only using it, how then it still will be for the detriment of the whole institution. So let's just move into the first thing, right? Sustainability. What does this then look like? We think that at the point at which then you have way more students, or we have a majority of students that fall under the category of being marginalized and being in that identity group, we don't think that UJ will be able to sustain the amount of funds that it will need then to cater to all of those individuals, because technically then they belong to that marginalized identity group, right? But furthermore, we think that on top of UJ not being able to be sustainable with being able to give each and every single Black student bursary, right? We think that secondly then, it doesn't speak to the sort of credibility that UJ then would need to have. Because what criteria is it that you're going to have when you have a Black person and another one basically falling inside the same marginalized identity group? Who do you then pick between the two? We are still waiting to hear that from opposition. Maybe we'll get a much more clear case as to where exactly we would likely go with only prioritizing marginalized identity groups, right? Cool. Let's deal with even if then this was the case, and even if we then value someone's identity group more than the actual skills that they have. What would then this look like? We think that first of all, it's not going to be something that speaks justice to the very same injustices that they are trying to actually then approach. Because at the point at which Black people weren't allowed to go into UJ just because they are Black, we think that then it is counterintuitive when we take the same metric of saying, hey, I am Black and marginalized, therefore I want a bursary, is going to actually be something that works. We don't think that then for affirmative action it does any justice to this. But then also secondly, we are looking at the idea of the value of the merit then. What do we value then after only looking at your skin color, right? In terms of merit, that doesn't become a thing anymore. Mambo already alluded to the fact that we have things like Eugenius, we have things like Golden Key, and these are very important in terms of valuing somebody's merit. We don't think that this then is going to be the case when you don't have incentive to actually work hard to be able to be a part of Golden Key, to be able to be a part of those like top achievers and get the benefits thereof. So if you stand for a side that actually values the type of merit and the type of skills and the type of hard work that you put into your studies and getting the benefits of that, then you definitely side for proposition.
Thank you so much, proposition team. Wow, let's hear the closing remarks. Over to your opposition team.
Okay. Hello, my name is Utandwa and I'll be speaking for the opposition team. I'd like to first contend with some points brought to us by side proposition. First of all, they tell us that they are looking on their side for a more holistic way to give away these bursaries. But what is more holistic than looking at every factor that brought the person to that point, including their marginalization as a people or as an individual? Because, like Gamo says, and an idea that you refuse to contend with for some reason, those individuals, when to get to the point of coming to university, a lot of the fact that they're marginalized, that they're poor or that they're black and that they come from certain communities gives them less access to educational tools that would give them the ability to then achieve those merits that you guys hold so highly. That is a contention that I feel like hasn't been touched upon. And you say again that it's not sustainable because we only have a finite amount of money. So then why would you give that money to individuals that can already afford to come to school? Why not concentrate on the marginalized individuals that can't afford it? Because that's the whole point of the bursary. The whole point of a bursary is to give opportunity to those that would have previously, without it, not have been able to get said opportunity. We feel that by taking this away, by trying to overlook the fact that an individual is marginalized and only look at the merit, you then do a disservice not only to that individual, but to the community as a whole. Because now you have a bunch of kids that would have afforded to go to university anyway with degrees, and then we have a bunch of kids back home that are living without a degree just because they weren't given that opportunity, just because nobody looked at the factors of their life as a whole when trying to find out what the situation is. Like you said here, you said you think that it doesn't speak justice. Well, I think that your approach doesn't speak justice to the situations that real individuals, because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about real people have to live through when growing up and trying to come to these places that we hold so highly. Okay? For a lot of these kids, the education that is given in UJ is their only way to make a difference in their lives. It's their only way to come up. And I think that we have to look at that as well. Okay? Then I would also like to say the reason why we think it would be a better world if we kept on looking at the marginalization of these communities as a criteria included with their merits is because we get to give more kids that would have not necessarily had the ability to come to university and get educated an opportunity to do so, thus helping more families out of these places, thus helping more of these individuals to come and make a difference in their lives. We think that it gives us a more inclusive world where the corporate world and all the other sectors, including the school itself, has more inclusivity towards these individuals that would have in any other case not gotten the opportunity to be there. We think that it also concentrates more on the need of these individuals to get to get said education. So we give those who need it the ability to come in and get what they need. Okay. And then we would like to say, to close real quick, I'd like to say, if you believe in a world where everybody is given opportunity, regardless of where they are from, regardless of their ability, then you stand with us. Thank you very much.
the proposing and the opposing team. As you can hear, there's different ideas from both perspectives, and we are talking about the University of Johannesburg internal bursary department that would like to allocate funding only on merits and not on marginalized identities. Now, the proposing team has already touched on intersectionality. They spoke about affirmative action and also about the merit system, which already consists of the Eugenius and the orange carpet. And the opposing team came with a different angle where they spoke about what about the importance of the backgrounds of these individuals. Now, I'm going to give it over to them again to give us their final perspectives on it, and then we'll call it an episode.
Okay, cool. So if we're going to speak about backgrounds, let's understand that in the status quo, there are already mechanisms that take those into consideration. Things like external bursaries, things like abonasfas that look at whether or not you're poor, whether or not you're black, exist. You didn't explain to us why specifically UJ has a specific mandate to award people bursaries based on the color of their skin. Secondly, they tell us that they want more access. No one in this debate is denying the idea of access. We all want access for students. Where you guys fail specifically is to tell us what marginalized groups specifically look like. What are we looking at when we're analyzing marginalized groups? Which is where our argument on intersectionality and the problem that raises comes in. Who do you pick between a black woman and a disabled white man who is poor, a black woman who is rich? You didn't tell us that.
Awesome. So the one misconception that we keep on continuously getting from team proposition that they don't understand that UJ is a top university in Africa and the most inclusive university in Africa. It prides itself with such merits, with such principles, right? And the moment that you start taking away the ability of individuals to be able to partake in studies merely because they can't afford it, and yet they still are able, but they still show the potential of being successful students within varsity, then we ought to take them preferably over a white wealthy student, right? What we've been trying to tell you this entire time is like, yes, we can see that NSFAS and external bursaries do exist, but they don't necessarily consider everything. And that's why it's a lot more important for UJ to take into account to supplement these students more.
What was you proposing?
So one more point of clarification, and this is going to essentially go to underlie what their whole team premise is made out of. And it's this notion that they think that the only students that are able to be eligible for these bursaries are if, like, for example, you can already afford it. We don't think that this is true. Why? Because we already told you about the majority of students already being marginalized. So likely what you would get is UJ actually then giving bursaries to those who can't afford, yes, cool, but those who actually then show effort and to putting behind their studies, behind their careers that they're trying to actually attain, that they're actually serious for this. And because of this, that's why we actually value merit over just the skin color.
Final comments, opposing team?
Yes, I understand where they're coming from, okay? But they don't understand what we're trying to say. They're not taking into account the fact that those who are not marginalized already have a leg up. So it's easier for them to attain those spots that are more needed by those who are already marginalized. The problem here is that there is a lack of understanding of the essential nuances that are within the idea of marginalization by these individuals and their ability to attain and properly achieve those levels of merit that we want them to achieve against an opponent, essentially, that has been given a leg up their entire life.
All right, you heard it here on UJ. Let's talk this house as the University of Johannesburg's internal bursary department would allocate funding based only on merits and not only for marginalized identity groups. Let's continue the conversation online. It is hashtag UJTV, hashtag UJDU takeover. And on Instagram, to follow the debating team, it is UJ_debating. Thank you, Siyawonga. See you in the next episode.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.